Hello, everyone. This is Cynthia Mazzaferro with Powerful Beyond Measure. And today I have two fabulous guests for you today. First is Traci Mazzaferro, and she is a partner in a New York City law firm, Richardson and Rosso. Previously, she had worked at Pfizer for 30 years as a senior VP and Chief Intellectual Property Counsel, Global Head of IP Litigation and General Counsel of Europe. She is now, though, an award-winning author of an Amazon bestseller, Inflection Point, War and Sacrifice in Corporate America. But today, I'm happy to also say she is a #1 author of the book that she's written for Kevin. Kevin Coughlin is here with us. Hi, Kevin. How are you?
Hi.
And Kevin is actually, the story is written about Kevin, and Traci has allowed his story to be beautifully expressed in this book, and we're going to talk about this book. And so let me tell you a little bit about Kevin. Kevin Coughlin has appeared on numerous radio and TV shows. He's inspired a CNN story chronicling his experience living as a blind person in New York City, which was instrumental in establishing its first blind advocacy program. His story, Blind Injustice, was featured on the CBS Evening News. He lives in New York City with his beloved dog, Elias, and we are excited to really talk about your beautiful book, and thank you for being here tonight with me.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So let's start with this. I guess we need to start in the beginning as to when you started to lose your sight. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Kevin?
It happened very suddenly and dramatically in 1997, and I had perfect vision before, 20/20 vision, and just one day I noticed I was having difficulty reading the New York Times and just with street signs, and by the time I got to my first doctor, which was 2 or 3 days later, I had lost all of my central vision, and very, very quickly I went from perfect vision to blind, and it was devastating, as you can imagine.
I can't even imagine, to be honest. What were your thoughts and your fears at that moment during those 3 days?
It's hard to even explain. I was such a visual person. My whole world, my hobby had been photography from the time I was 14 years old. I loved taking black and white photographs of buildings and flowers. And I was an art lover, went to museums and galleries. So it just, rocked my world. And unfortunately, I can't access a lot of the feelings now, because when the feelings came up, I just grabbed the bottle and started drinking. So that was how I pushed the feelings down at that point.
Right. And it's so beautiful that you share that part of the story in your book, how so often we use vices in our lives to deal with stress and emotional unrest and dissatisfaction with life, and how drinking had been part of your life even before you actually had the loss of your vision.
It had, and it's an odd fact that for a time early on after the diagnosis of my blindness, it was the drinking that saved me, because for a brief time, it allowed me to just face the blindness intellectually. Whenever the pain, the loss, the anger would come up, I would drink more and more to not let the feelings come to the fore. So in a weird way, it allowed me to quickly deal with the blindness, but only on intellectual terms. And it was much, much later, after I got sober, about 3.5 years later, that I slowly, over a 9-year period, started dealing with those feelings.
I really love that. I love your dedication in your book, if you don't mind me reading it.
Not at all.
Blindness can be an empowering force rather than a limiting one. And I think that's so beautiful. Can you, and we're going to get into your book a little bit more, but can you just kind of as a culmination, give that the empowering force? I love that, because I speak on empowerment and inspiration. And to me, I think we all need to empower ourselves. And how did your blindness become that empowering force for you?
like so many things in life, it was a process. So initially, I just was so self-conscious about the blindness, and just I just I didn't want people to think I was blind, so I did anything I could to not appear blind. It was so crazy. So I always had to look perfect, and I always had to not, just act like what I thought a blind person would. So it was kind of crazy. But over time, as I developed a level of acceptance, I did feel empowered in that, like, whenever one has a life-altering event and you're able to confront it and just, rise above it, as I did with time, I guess that was the empowering factor, to just not only get sober, but to just navigate the world, and just navigate the world without sight. That alone is empowering. I
Absolutely.
hope that answers your question.
No, it did. And I think it's so, I'd like to speak to our audience that's watching this. Not everyone's going to have a traumatic event with blindness, but I believe that we all have self-limiting beliefs, some form of handicap that we perceive. So I love to always try to have our stories, the books I bring to them, how it can resonate in their life. And I think that no matter what our self-perceived limitation is, whether it's real or unreal, that we can choose to navigate the world, as you said, to choose to be our victor and to not become the victim, and be empowered in the life that we're choosing to live and that we've been dealt to live. So I really love that. And I wanted to have your reflection on that, because I think it's so inspiring for our audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. So could you also just briefly tell us that your condition was a genetic condition that actually happens typically younger, but that it's called, I should say, two Leber's. You probably say it better than I do. So
Leber's optic neuropathy.
There you go. And we're going to hear a really wonderful little end to this story, his story, where some of his sight is regained. So we'll be looking forward to hearing that. So stay tuned if you're listening to this interview. So, Kevin, what made you want your story to be written? And what do you hope your readers will take away from it? There's so many lessons.
Would you like to answer that one?
No, What did you hope?
That's a difficult question. Similar to the last question with empowerment, in that I learned so much from the blindness, and I changed so much as a person, in that all of the cliches that we think of with life experience. So for instance, that, with loss, we gain strength, and with struggle and adversity, we grow. All of those things, I never realized they were true until I actually experienced them myself. And I grew so much and changed so much as a person as a result of living with the blindness. And then the process of, slowly getting my sight back has been such a learning process. And just when I lost my vision, I was angry and self-absorbed and just somewhat entitled, and just I'm so different today. I'm serene and kind and empathetic and just a different person, just through, I guess, to sum it up, I would say that loss is a powerful teacher.
I think you're so true. And even your book title, I don't know if you have a copy of your book right there, Tracy. It's called Unblinded. It wasn't blinded or blind or blindness. It was unblinded. And even though so much of your story is about the story of you losing your sight, you actually gained sight and wisdom in your life through that loss. And again, I think all of our listeners or watchers here can actually also realize, when they look back at their life and what's going on in their life now, that we can learn from our difficulties and And sometimes our sight is actually more acute when you actually open up to see what is the truth that lies in front of us. So Traci, let me hear from you a little bit. So how did you meet Kevin, and what made you to connect and write his wonderful story?
So it was Easter Sunday 2 years ago, and my husband came home from walking our dogs. Kevin and I both live in the same New York City neighborhood called Murray Hill, and he was literally breathless with excitement. He came to the door shouting, do you know the blind guy in our neighborhood? And I didn't know Kevin, but everybody knew of Kevin because he would be walking through the neighborhood with his guide dog, and he's tall and he's handsome, and his dog is so adorable. So everybody, if you had asked that question, most everybody would have noticed, in our neighborhood, Kevin walking with Elias. And I said, yeah, I know who you mean. And he goes, he can see again. And so, of course, my pharmaceutical hat went on, and I said, oh, is he taking a new drug? And he said, no. And then I said, well, did he have an operation? And he said, no. He said, it just came back. And I said, wow. I said, I guess that's an Easter miracle. And that was like really the end of it. And then the next time he came home, which was very shortly after that, he said, do you think you could ask around with some of your writer colleagues, because at this point now I have some author colleagues as well as some legal colleagues, if anybody would be willing to write Kevin's story for him. He wants a story written. So I had gone back to work full time in the law firm, and Inflection Point had already been published, and I wasn't really thinking about writing a second book. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And then we just started, and then we sat together, Kevin and I, with Joel's help, hours after hours.
Traci had a hip replacement, so it was a couple of months before we actually met.
Yeah. And he told me the story, and then he had kept this journal, which was very helpful. The journal started in August of 2013 when he first got the first glimmer in the medicine cabinet mirror in the middle of the night. But we just sat together, and he told me his story, and I started to put the pieces together in the form of chapters.
That's great. And I love that each of your chapter, you have a journal from the days when his sight did improve. And what I think it does for the reader, at least for me, it offered hope. And yes. I think hope is so powerful, and miracles are so powerful, which I believe in. And I also had a friend who actually fell 3 different times. And the last time she fell, one time was bumping her head, the next time was bumping her eye. The last time was having a stick go into her eye. Wow. And she actually lost complete vision. And she was a healer, somewhat like myself, an energy healer, and she believed in miracles and very strong faith. And she kept thinking, I feel like I'm just tripping over my feet. There's something I'm not really seeing in my life. And she felt that this fall, where she lost her sight, was actually kind of a symptom of her not seeing what she needed to see in life. And as she started to reflect on her life a little bit more, ironically, the day she was supposed to go in for surgery to have her eyeball removed, she started seeing shadows in the medicine cabinet and light, just like you.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yes, it is.
And her vision, we like to talk about it as we talked, your vision can actually be more acute when you actually don't have physical sight. And we can see life a whole lot different. And I encourage everyone that's listening to this, as we continue to talk about the book, to go out and look for this amazing book, Unblinded. It's being released tomorrow. And it's a book that can really relate to everyone and transform your life, and to really empower you to transform your life. So Kevin, having to deal with loss of sight is very hard for any of us to imagine. So what were some of the most difficult parts for you?
I would say the most difficult. So the logistics were remarkably easy. For some reason, I was able to quickly, learn to navigate with a cane and a guide dog. The hardest, and a lot of people wouldn't even think of this, is not having access to facial expressions, to nonverbal cues. That is the biggest, and I would say handicap, but I hate that word. I mean, just to say that word makes me cringe, but that is the biggest obstacle, not having access to nods and winks and waves and all the stuff we take for granted with daily life. And, even though one is supposed to, ideally get that affirmation from within, we rely on all of that just in our daily lives. And it's such a loss not to have that. And people are so accustomed to not communicating with someone until they make eye contact. So it just limits your communication and social interaction so much. So that was the biggest.
Right. Oh, I can totally resonate with that. The subtleties of just what our physical sight relays back to us to understand what's going on, what's the emotional response. You just you don't have that input, that information that comes into you.
Yeah.
It's amazing though. In your book, you talk about how you fold your dollar bills a certain way to know the different denominations. Of course, color of your wardrobe, how to coordinate that. I mean, there's so much you have to learn, and you do a beautiful job sharing that with us and your struggles with it as well. So, what would you say is your greatest lesson that you've learned from your blindness and actually now your vision?
The greatest lesson, I would say, is serenity and calm. Just the entire change in my entire being, I guess. I was this crazy, manic New Yorker, typical what one would think of as a New Yorker, just rush, and rushing to nowhere, and just always impatient and just always annoyed for no reason. And I was the movie New Yorker that you hate. And now I am just like a kind, nice person. So that's the biggest lesson. It sounds self-serving, but I don't mean it to.
No, I truly believe it when I speak and do my workshops, this inner peace, finding this inner sanctuary of completeness, of seeing your greatness, which we all have, not greater over somebody else, but just finding that that meditative, relaxed state of sublime peace is such a beautiful place. And it's very hard for people to understand finding that place, but it is so important to really try to attain that. It's just an amazing place to live from.
It sounds like you and I have a similar spiritual practice.
Yes, I think so. And
meditation has been a big part of my healing as well.
Yeah. And so let's just continue with that for a second, Kevin. So in your state of sublime inner peace, how has that helped you to open up to your intuition, to wisdom, if you believe from a higher spiritual being or entity, if you will, whether it's the universe, God, whatever that is. But how has that helped you to gain insight, we'll use the word sight there, into what's really important in your life?
It's been such a process over many years. It's difficult to put into words. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It can be so profound. Sometimes it's actually hard to articulate it,
yeah.
But it's so transformative. And I think your book shares that it is so transformative. Would you be willing to share a little bit about the drinking and how that became such a vice and so crippling, of how it really was a numbing force, and then how you decided that needed to go? You needed to decide no longer can you drink.
So I lost my vision at age 36, and I now know in retrospect that I was clearly an alcoholic at that point in time. I hadn't ever said that word to myself. I started drinking. I was a daily drinker from age 19, and I used alcohol initially just to take the edge off my day and then just to whatever issue I had, to just, as I alluded to earlier, to not face any feelings, and especially, of course, difficult feelings. And when the blindness hit, just all of those feelings, the loss, the pain, the anger, all of that, I just used alcohol to numb. And just one day, about 3.5 years after the onset of the blindness, I used to get my alcohol delivered from a local liquor store. And as I got these 2 bottles of very large bottles, like 2-liter bottles of this really cheap vodka, so cheap that this is crazy. It was 1406 2-liter bottle, just to give you an indication of how quality it was. But I was bending down. I was hiding one in a backpack on the floor of my coat closet, and the other in a duffel bag on the floor of the closet. And I had done this, since I had started getting my alcohol delivered. And on this particular day, for some reason, I was overcome with emotion. And it just hit me. Obviously, on some deep level, I must not approve of my own drinking if A, I live alone and I'm hiding my alcohol, and B, I'm blind. So that was my aha moment, like something needs to be done. And shortly thereafter, I called a friend who I knew was sober, and ended up going to my first meeting.
I actually love that chapter. I love that story because it was so paradoxical. Like you said, what am I hiding this from? And really, you had been hiding yourself from yourself through the alcohol. And it became so crystal clear in your vision in that aha moment that was really the turning point in that sobriety change to no longer am I going to have alcohol consume me. And so this is also, as you see, those that are watching this realize that this is a story about how we hide from our truths, how we use vices to blame other things, other people, and how we need to empower ourselves into seeking our own remedies, action steps to find that place of peace that, Kevin's so beautifully talking about, that really has brought him into a different place of beautiful life and living. So Traci, now that you have written this book with Kevin's assistance, and being so pivotally moved, because I've also been moved reading it, how would you say you been impacted, and what was the most important thing you've learned from Kevin's story?
Well, I think I myself had started, for lack of a better expression, on a spiritual path. I know that's overused, but that's pretty accurate. Five years ago, up until that point, I was pretty connected to the outside world, and being a lawyer and a litigator too is quite, by its nature, confrontational. And at some point, I just took a pivot and started to look inside myself. And many of the things that Kevin talks about, I've experienced as well. And the tools that he's used, I also used to make this change in the way I looked at life and the way I looked at myself. Kevin uses meditation a lot, and I do that as well. But one trick that I had was, in order to get control over my thoughts, whenever I would be on observation of them, and when I would notice that I had an unkind thought, a negative thought, I would immediately stop and replace it with one of gratitude. And it could be anything, that I was just grateful for. I was actually very grateful for a while for my daughter's new puppy, because this little puppy was so cute. And I would just think about this little puppy, her face, Addison.
Yeah.
And I would immediately, at least I can't think of two things at once. You can kind of toggle between thoughts. So I used that trick, and over time, like Kevin is describing. So when I met Kevin, I recognized in him a kindred spirit. I think you recognized in me that we were both people who had been one way for a large part of our life. For me, it was the first 58 years. And for you, it was the first how many years? 48 maybe.
Yeah.
So a large part of our life focused externally. I don't, neither one of us was a bad person, but it's just your focus. So I was focused on external achievement, doing well in school, going to law school, getting those kinds of things. And then I started to really focus inside. So when I met Kevin, which is one of the reasons I agreed quickly to write the book, because it's difficult to write somebody else's story, because you're trying to get out of them not only just the facts, but the emotions. And when I wrote Inflection Point, it was much easier because it was my story. I know how I felt, and in many ways I had to temper the emotions. They were flowing out of me. But with Kevin's story, I was so busy at first trying to just get the facts that it took a while before I could feel. But I would say, to answer your question, that the thing that I learned from my relationship with Kevin is he has this sort of unbridled faith. And no matter what is going on and how bleak the circumstances may be, he always just keeps believing. And it really taught me that, well, if in the face of blindness and some of the other tremendous obstacles that he's overcome, he could always maintain his connection to his higher self, I certainly could continue on my journey to do that, because that was always my goal. And it was more challenging for me for a while to not get disconnected from that and to not become focused again on the external world. And it was a little bit tricky because I didn't want to lose my ability to function in the external world, because one thing, I wanted to use my gifts to manifest things, for example, Kevin's book, but without becoming externally focused again. And Kevin really taught me how to do that. He taught me how, watching him stay focused on his internal self while we went through this process, because of course we went through the same thing that any author goes through, which you know yourself. I mean, despite the fact that I already had a book published, we still had multiple rejections from so many publishers before we finally started getting some offers. And we, of course, they come in at the same time after being rejected and rejected and rejected. But he always was like, it's okay, we're just going to get, it's all going to work out. And watching him, I said, okay, this is a good example for you, Traci.
Right. It's called divine timing. And
yes,
sometimes the more we push for it to happen in our time, it's not going to be the right time for the success of what we're accomplishing and working
right.
for.
So true.
Yeah. You choke it off, actually, because you start grabbing at it, and then that causes like a current that actually chokes it off what you're trying to get.
The more we put pressure on ourselves, the more we fail. And it's more out of living and loving and enjoying life, happiness, all that stuff, that really greatest success can be achieved in all that we do. So your book is beautiful, both of you. So Kevin, what are the doctors saying when you went back to them and told them you were seeing shapes and colors and light and stuff? So, and what's your prognosis?
The doctors initially were just dumbfounded and couldn't believe it, and almost didn't believe me, like almost as though I had some kind of psychosomatic blindness or something for all those years. So the medical community generally believes that once one has optic nerve damage, that it's permanent. So I had no hope of seeing again. So it's been a slow process, and I really have not had much help from the medical community. I've basically, done it on my own through nutrition and meditation and prayer.
That's great. And if they can't explain it, they don't understand it, they don't know how to deal with that unknown.
If they haven't read it in a book or had, scientific data.
But miracles happen every day, and we are miracle beings that belong to a greater, higher source. And so if they can make mountains and oceans and the celestial beings and this and that, us humans that has been made, we're miracles too. And nerves do regenerate, and very slowly, but they do improve. So, well, this has been really quite a beautiful interview, and I love your story. Thank you so much for sharing. Is there a special message you want to leave our watchers, our listeners here with, Kevin, before we close?
That Unblinded is a universal story in the sense that regardless of what life-altering event someone has, so although the stories in the book surround sight, basically it's about confronting any life-altering event, and as I said earlier, just being open to growing from it and to learning from it. And, you know, as so many wise people have said, you know, one lives a long life if you're always open to growing and learning. And I've found that through my process that has been one of the most important things, allowing myself to always be open to learning something new every day. And I hope that's, you know, something that people get out of this book, that regardless of whether someone has a diagnosis of cancer or loses a loved one or, you know, ends a relationship, whatever it is, they can confront it and grow from the loss and learn from the pain.
And have hope and believe is so instrumental in that, accomplishing that result. So thank you. I think those are very
true.
beautiful
Thank
words.
you.
Thank you. That was beautiful words. And so, Traci, can you tell people where they can connect to your website?
Well, Kevin and I each have a website. His is Kevin Coughlin, Unblinded.com, and mine is just my name, TraciMedfordRosso.com.
Great, great. So I hope you all go out and purchase their book, Unblinded, and it's also a great gift. Holidays are coming up, Mother's Day, Father's Day, graduations, whatever. So it's a beautiful book, and I wish you both great success, and thank you so much for writing and sharing your story.
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
Take care. Okay, once again, this is Cynthia Mazzaferro. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week. Take care.